So part of the magic around watch collecting is that when you select a piece, it is not going to necessarily work for everybody. It's catered to what you as a collector might enjoy with your preferences of design as well as wearability. But that question of wearability is sometimes a little bit easier to navigate given that you have so many different watches out there at a variety of different sizes. But the task today is to have a video where we look at watches that can fit pretty much any wrist size out there. In the past, we've looked at a premise like this, but it was a bit different considering that we were only looking at a single watch and a style that could look good on a variety of different wrists. In this video, what we're gonna be doing instead is looking at watches that have different sizes within its specific model family that can overlap with, I would say, 90 to 99% of wrist sizes out there that want to at least think about it as being a consideration for their collection. So a few things to clear up at the beginning. These have to be watches that could be viable for the vast majority of wrists out there. Also, we're looking for watches that have at least 2 different case sizes that overlap with this wide variety of people, but if we have 3 different sizes, that'll make them a even more suitable candidate for a video like this. Also, I'm thinking about what are the sizes chosen by the brand. Say the Tissot PRX, 40 millimeters and 35 millimeters. I would argue there's a larger percentage. I wouldn't say it's a massive percentage, but there's a good percentage of people that might want something that splits the difference. So a watch like that, even though they have 2 sizes that are pretty mass appealing, I would argue that that doesn't probably belong on a list like this. Also, these can't be watches of different model families. You can't combine the Tudor Black Bay 54, 58, and 41 as one singular family because they are different watches at the end of the day. Further, they have to be matching in appearance. So small little design differences with dial markings or maybe the date window, maybe there's no date on another. I'm looking more for aesthetics. Do they look the same as things scale up? If there's dramatic differences, that will also not be eligible for this. And also, we are not going to include micro brands because that would make this a little bit of a longer video and opens up the field to way more considerations. So a video like this, I don't think it makes as much sense. And quite frankly, micro brands typically don't do this as much as major brands do when they're thinking about mass market viability. As you'll see with a lot of the watches here, that is what they're catering their watches towards. People that are looking for a watch that can basically check off a lot of different boxes and can be suitable for many different people out there. So to kick us off, we're going to look at a watch from Seiko, actually 2 different watches from Seiko, but they are generally the same. So you have the SRP-K family of Seiko 5KXs and the SRP-D. So if you remember when the initial relaunch of the Seiko 5 Sports was unveiled, it was brought forth with these SRP-D models as being usually the poster child of what this whole new movement of Seiko 5 Sports watches were going to be. Those came forward with a Seiko SKX style case at 42.5 millimeters, but that brought on some conversation as well about, are these supposed to be replacements of the SKX? That brought some confusion, and I think these were given an unfair shake at the beginning. Once you got past that and realized what these watches were, versatile watches that can be worn in the everyday, they started to make a lot more sense for enthusiasts. So you have the one size with the SRP-Ds being at 42.5 millimeters, very wearable lug to lug though, at 46 millimeters. I think this looks suitable for medium to smaller wrists, but also can look great on larger wrists. So that checks off that box. There still were some people though that wanted a smaller case option, like you saw with the SKX 013. How can we get that with this Seiko 5 case? And we saw that a few years later with the SRP-K models. These come with a much different case, closer to 38 millimeters. The lug to lug is shortened, but it's only 44.2 millimeters in comparison to the 46 millimeters on those SRP-D models. But with that diameter across the wrist being shrunk down with these SRP-K models, as well as that lug-to-lug modification, these are going to overlap with a wide array of enthusiasts, and the design, for the most part across both of these, are going to remain relatively unchanged. Next up, we have a watch from Hamilton, 2 watches from Hamilton, I guess, considering we're talking about 2 different sizes, but these are 2 sizes that I also think work. Hamilton Murph, this is the khaki field Murph, first released in 2019. This is a watch that was featured on the wrist in the movie Interstellar back in 2014. The watch that was initially unveiled to honor the film was in 2019, and it followed the same dimension set as the prop watch featured in the film. So that was 42 millimeters, pretty long on the lug to lug at 52 millimeters. So this was going to be best suited for people with larger wrists. And given that it is a field watch design without an external rotating bezel, it probably only added to that dial opening and making this watch appear a little bit larger than even the 42 millimeter diameter. Shortly after the release of this watch, we started to see the piling on of requests. Can we get a smaller Murph? That day came in late 2022 when Hamilton basically responded directly to the enthusiast community with releasing a 38mm version. The other thing that was notable about the 38mm is they actually changed the proportions with the length of the case compared to the diameter. You'll notice the lug-to-lug on the 38mm version is dramatically different compared to that of the 42mm. They wear very differently, but I think if you look at these watches and the Venn diagram of overlap for all the wrist sizes out there, this is going to encircle a large percentage of people out there. And yes, I will note there is one difference between these watches with the second hand, but I hope you let that slide. I think these generally are the same. A brand that's always been pretty good about upholding this idea is Christopher Ward, and it is wild to see what Christopher Ward has done in the last few years and changing their whole perception amongst the watch enthusiast crowd. They were started back in 2004, they're based in the UK and have quickly scaled production and acquired a Swiss movement manufacturing arm. They've been busy with changing their outward perception with different model releases. I would say the Bel Canto was the tipping point to really change this image outwardly. But all along the way, they had watches that were steady, they were reliable, and they were pretty good value for money with their no-nonsense approach. One of those watches that you have to consider when talking about this idea is the Christopher Ward C60 Trident Pro 300. It's a bit of a mouthful, but this is one of these watches that is almost an archetype for this style within the dive watch category and fits the mold of what we're looking at for a video like this. You have a 38mm option, a 40mm option, and a 42mm option. I would argue that these are the absolute sweet spots for pockets of enthusiasts for what they might be looking for a dive watch. 38mm measures out to 45mm on the lug-to-lug, the 40 measures out to 47.45 on the lug-to-lug, and then the 42, not too far out to that end, but even the largest wrists out there are going to find this wears well with that 49.3mm lug-to-lug. This is just a check, check, and check. It's an answer for all the different pockets I could imagine somebody would fall for a dive watch, and this is a great example of doing this well and doing it at a price that is pretty reasonable, all things considered, for a Swiss-made watch. Moving along to our next brand here, and this is a recent development with this model. We have the Longines Conquest. You probably remember last year in 2023, Longines completely revamped the Conquest line. They updated it aesthetically, updated the bracelet, the design overall was changed, the crown guard system was completely different compared to those 2010 iterations of the model family, and also upgraded the formula from the mechanical side of things with the L888.5. At the time of the release of this collection in 2023, you had a 34mm, which I will argue is going to be a different proposition altogether given some of the stylistic changes there, but then you had a 41. So what was the number one request, it seemed like, when you were talking about this watch online? You would see comments, 38 to 39mm, we need a size like that. And shortly thereafter, actually less than a year later, Longines released the 38mm Conquest with this updated design format. Now these are more everyday style watches, so if I'm thinking about what is a great place to position two different sizes that can overlap with both smaller and larger wrists, I think 38mm with the dimensions here on that diameter with a 46.7mm lug to lug is a perfect pairing for someone with a smaller to medium sized wrist. And those that have a medium to larger sized wrist are also not going to be neglected with the 41mm option with that 49.1mm lug to lug. I find, again, with more of these style of watches, everyday format, not a rotating bezel, that the dial is going to take up more of that bezel to dial ratio. So this watch wears slightly larger than the proposed diameter, I would say, if not true to size. But for an everyday style watch, I think these are in a sweet spot. And if you're gonna pick two sizes, I think Longines picked two phenomenal ones to have this overlap with the vast majority of people out there. So another brand that I could mention here for having a lot to say about multiple case sizes would be Oris. Now, Oris is in a cycle of changing as of right now with some of their collections. You saw the update with the Aquas collection, so it's not as apparent what is going to happen with the different case sizes for that collection. At the initial release, they didn't unveil all of the different case sizes for the Aquas that we've seen in the past. So I didn't think that was the right Oris model to include here. Same with the Diver 65, because the Diver 65, yes, has a lot of different cases, but you have the cotton candy at 38mm, which is very different than the 36mm Diver 65, which is different than the 40mm Diver 65, which is a little bit different than the 42mm Diver 65. So it wasn't as perfect, but there was one watch family from Oris that I thought fit a little bit more seamlessly here, and that was the Oris Big Crown Pointer Date family. You have a 36, a 38, and a 40 millimeter. This model family goes back to the 1930s and is one of my favorite complication types in this price segment, and Oris really owns it for this price range. The cathedral hands with the coin edge bezel with the romantic complication is something that you're not going to see many brands encroach on or even try to any degree until you start to get up to a higher price range. And I love how this combines as this everyday but also dress appropriate watch. Looking at the dimensions across the board, the 36 millimeter has a 43 millimeter lug to lug. The Servo Volante is the representation for that 38 millimeter case with a 45.5 millimeter lug to lug. And the 40 is going to have a 48 millimeter lug to lug. You could argue on the larger of wrists out there, this might be cutting it a bit short, but I think that 40 millimeter could still work well on very large wrists. And given its styling to more romantic and classic vintage inspiration, I think you can have this one work on the smaller side of things and it won't look out of place even on those larger wrists. Now moving along, we have a brand that I don't think many people would consider. I am going to make an argument here because it's a really strange range of sizes. Some on the larger side of things might have an issue with it, but these are dress-oriented watches, and the silhouette of these designs are not normal compared to many other watches that we're going to look at, especially from that lug-to-lug side of things. The watches are the Nomos Tangente, the Orion, and the Ludwig. So this is the trio of dress watches coming from Nomos. This comes out of the 1990s and have been pillars of their design for years. The Tangente is going to have the mixing of linear markings as well as the numerical markings on the hours. The Ludwig is the Roman numeral dial, and the Orion is going to have all the applied linear markings across the dial. All of them feature small seconds, and you have 3 different case sizes to choose from. You have a 33 millimeter option, I know, very small, a 35 millimeter option, which again, some might be saying very small, and then a 38 millimeter option. Now you might be thinking, this is crazy to include this on a list like this. What about the larger wrists among us? The weird thing about these watches though is how they wear across the board. The 33 millimeter has a 42.3 millimeter lug to lug, which is not insignificant. The 35 millimeter, which I own as an Orion, has a 45 millimeter lug to lug. That is very close to that 38 millimeter Servo Volante that we just mentioned from Oris. And then the 38 millimeter has a 48 millimeter lug to lug. So we're getting into Rolex Submariner territory. And when you say that a Rolex Submariner would work on the variety of wrists out there, I would argue it would. So I think this is getting into that range where within these sizes, very weird range of sizes that we're picking here with a 33 millimeter case being part of this trio, I still think that this can work on many wrists out there. This is more of a hot take for this video, but if you ever tried on a Nomos, you might be able to back me up on this in the comments down below. If you don't want to back me up, that's fine too, and you can disagree with me. Now we move into one that I don't think you can argue whatsoever. This is like an archetype for being perfect for the description of this video. We have the Tudor 1926. Now this is a watch that takes many classic traditional design elements and infuses it into a everyday package. You have different case sizes to choose from, dial options to choose from, but you have plenty to choose from when it comes to diameters from this entire package. You have a 28 millimeter option, a 36 millimeter option, a 39 millimeter option, and a 41 millimeter option. This is probably as good as you're going to come across for being able to check off every single size that you could think of for every single wrist out there. The 1926 name is reference to Hans Wilsdorf when he registered the brand name Tudor. Again, classic designing here with the texturized surface for that dial. Multiple different dial colors to choose from. The one that I always typically reference is the opaline with the blue markers. 100 meters of water resistance and sits at the entry door for the brand just over $2,000, which I don't think enough people consider nowadays. You can get into a Tudor watch at retail pricing just around this $2,000 price range. Then you take the next leap up and you get into the Black Bay family. So this was all recently updated in 2023. What are these non-diver Tudor Black Bays, which probably fall underneath the shadow of the diving Black Bay models, but these are as versatile as you're going to come across and fit the mold of the video here today. You have a 31 millimeter option, a 36 millimeter option, a 39 millimeter option, and a 41 millimeter option. I forgot to mention with the Tudor 1926, as well as with these, you are seeing some differences in the calibers chosen as well as the power reserve depending on the size, but from 36 millimeters to 41 millimeters, this is where you get into the MT5400. We first saw the two-tone versions of these models get the MT caliber treatment. So these are the manufacturer caliber movements from Tudor. And then in 2023, we saw the stainless steel options get these as well. What came with the movement upgrade when these were unveiled last year was also going to be a different dial pattern, or finish, I should say. You also had a different crown design. You remember more of that fine tube structure with the housing of that crown stem. In this case, you have more of the faceting on the crown. So it looked a little bit more elevated in my opinion. So now we go from having multiple different options to having just two. But again, I think you could make the argument that the two sizes chosen for this next watch is going to have an ability to be worn on a wide variety of wrists out there. So we have the Omega Aquaterra. Let me call attention to what I'm talking about, because there are different Aquaterra models. You have the Aquaterra World Timer, which is its own thing, that's a larger case. Then you have the other version of the Aquaterra family outside of what we're gonna be talking about here with the Shades editions. Those were released in 2022, and those have 38mm cases, but they also have a different design style. We're trying to keep the same design style across the two different sizes, and for that, we look at the teakwood style dial versions of the Aquaterra. So this has this line horizontal pattern that you'll see with more contemporary versions of the Aquaterra. Within the 38 to the 41, very similar in their styling. The only thing that is different about these watches is going to be the movement on the inside. That's the most notable difference. So the 38mm are going to have the 8800 caliber, and the 41 are going to have the 8900 caliber. With those two movements, I think functionally, the two things that you'll call out, one barrel versus two barrels on the 8900 movement. You'll also in the 8900 movement, when you pull the crown to the second position, you'll be able to change the hour hand in an isolated position. And further, you have a slight extension on the power reserve, but this is mostly for performance and ensuring that there is a stable flow of energy down the gear train rather than extending a power reserve. So it's 60 hours versus 55 hours still. As I mentioned though, I think these are two sizes that are going to overlap with a wide variety of wrists. Now the 38mm is slightly a small watch. It's going to wear well, smaller to medium wrists, 38mm diameter and 45mm for the lug to lug. You are seeing slight differences in the thickness, around 1 millimeter in thickness for the 38mm, so it's a little thinner compared to that of the 41mm option that's going to extend up to 13.2 millimeters and a lug to lug of 47.9 millimeters, right around that 48mm cutoff. I find the Aquaterras wear a little bit larger than their proposed diameter, but not by much. We're seeing that everyday style again, dial opening, maybe creating a bit more presence across the board. But these watches, along with the next watch that we're going to talk about, I think epitomize versatility in the luxury segment. And speaking of epitomizing watches in the luxury segment when it comes to the concept of versatility, we have the Rolex Oyster Perpetual. The Rolex Oyster Perpetual is going to have a wide array of different cases that you can choose from. You have a 28, you have a 31, a 34, a 36, and a 41. Now there are some differences with the movement on the inside of those different models. So the 34, the 31, and the 28 are going to have a different caliber compared to the 36 and the 41mm options. But across the board, you have the general style and proportions that'll just be scaled up as you extend up in size. You have one of the most ubiquitous design languages that informs basically every other Rolex case since its genesis in 1926. It's an archetype, and it's no coincidence that Rolex, you looked at Tudor, what we talked about earlier, and then Rolex again. These guys are masters when it comes to identifying what are the desires for mass market appeal and giving people exactly that. This is a science for them. And there's no surprise to me that they have been able to carve out this lane where they have an answer for every single preference that someone might have for a case size. Dial colors to choose from are all there. Versatility is the name of the game of the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, and it is one of the pillars of it in the luxury segment. Now this next watch is going to have two different case sizes from Rolex. I wanted to include it because I thought it made the most sense and gave the highest ability to make everyone happy if you're looking in the direction of it. But further, there's this fun backstory where Rolex was trying to figure out what is the right case size for this model family. There's been this back and forth game over the last 15 years with the Rolex Explorer and what is the right case size. The 214-270 was released in 2010, and it was released at 39mm. This time was the first time that Rolex ever did this with an Explorer case. But then after a decade run, they said goodbye to the 39mm and brought back the long-standing 36mm case with the 124-270. That was in 2021. Then in 2023, Rolex did something that they had yet to do in the history of the Explorer family, creating a 40mm while simultaneously having a 36mm available. This funny back and forth is maybe silly, but it also is probably very calculated by Rolex. They have a robust market research team, and they're always identifying what are the asks from collectors out there and buyers of their products. They're doing this with great intention and with a meticulous eye. So now you have the best of both worlds. You have a 36mm Rolex Explorer with a 43mm lug to lug. This is the classic design. Many purists are gonna love the dimensions of this piece, but then you also now have a 40mm, which is going to wear a little bit larger than the 39, but very similar to those that love the way that 214-270 wore with that 48mm lug to lug. The fact that Rolex now has two different sizes for the Explorer makes me think that for a watch that is the foundation for many of their other designs, to have two different case options available, that was done with intention, and I think it was done with this idea in mind. How can we make this appealing to the most risks out there and cover all of our bases? And for the final watch on this list, it's a watch that you probably would not consider as being a great choice for a wide variety of risks because it's so often associated with the larger wristed individuals out there. That's the Breitling Navitimer. You think about why this watch was designed, this affiliation with pilots, the affiliation with the US Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the history of Breitling in creating aviation instruments. Back in the 1930s, the brand developed an internal aviation department. So when you're thinking about aviation, you're thinking about legibility, and oftentimes you would want something that's going to be larger in size to be able to do that. Further, Breitling had an era and a time where many of their watches were going to appeal to the larger wristed individuals among us. Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but that was probably leading to many people considering that there is not a watch for me here within the Navitimer family. But I would argue now that the Navitimer, maybe more than almost any other luxury chronograph on the market, has the perfect overlap with having different sizes that will scale up and work with a wide variety of wrists while keeping the core of its design identity intact as it scales up and down in size. So you have a 41mm Navitimer, a 43mm, and a 46mm option. Let's just talk through these different sizes because you hear 41mm on the smallest side. How is that going to work? These 41mm options are going to have a lug to lug of 46.8mm. And also if you measure just from that bezel point, it's around 40.5mm. But think about that, 46.8mm, that is a more compact lug to lug than the Tudor Black Bay 58. It's also more compact than the Nomos we talked about earlier with the Orion and the Ludwig at 38mm and further. And also this is gonna be even more compact to the lug to lug than a Hamilton Khaki Field at 38mm. So with the slide rule bezel, how this watch works on the wrist, this thing wears like a 39mm at 41 for its diameter here. Then you have the jump up to 43mm with a lug to lug at 49, which I would argue again, wears smaller. The same can be said for the 46, although it is a large watch. That'll appeal to the larger wristed individuals out there with a 52.3mm lug to lug. But given that diameter, I don't think that this is far reaching either. And I think you actually have a perfect trio of sizes for someone that wants to get into the Navitimer. And what I mentioned earlier, many brands, when they think about scaling in size, there's always sometimes a sacrifice that happens as it scales up or maybe down to make room for something. The Navitimer, although it has a ton of information on the dial, it's still able to preserve its identity despite being able to scale down. When a watch is able to do that, that is peak design in my opinion. But all right guys, that is my video here today looking at watches that can fit pretty much every wrist out there. If you enjoyed this video, found it helpful, please let me know in the comments down below. Give me a thumbs up here, really would appreciate that as well. Also, if you think there's another watch that could have been included on this list, leave a comment down below. Think about all those qualifying points at the beginning. I set up a lot of rules in this video to try to keep us in alignment for this video so we didn't start to include too many watches here. I wanted to create a uniform path for us to follow. Also, be sure to check out TeddyBallstar.com. TeddyBallstar.com is an authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. And also how we're able to fund all of our productions here is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd love to have your business. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing here. And we love what we do. Guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.